Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Originally, I planned on reading the Ace Frehley book today, but I changed my mind. The reason being that the view count from the most recent chapter of the Elvis book skyrocketed. So, you will get to hear Chapter 3 of Elvis and Me, written by his wife Priscilla Presley, early. Let's find out what happens next. Time had become my enemy. Elvis was due to return to the States on March 1st, 1960. I had only a few months left to spend as much time with him as I could. Every minute I wasn't with him, I thought of him. My life was now dominated by him, and yet there were times when I would be disappointed by him. One evening, he told me he would call, and didn't. When I finally heard from him the next day, he said, "Hi, baby. Do you think you can come over tonight?" "What happened last night? You were supposed to call." "I was? Oh." He had been concentrating on his karate lesson and had forgotten. I had to learn not to take his words to heart. It was disappointing, but it was just his way. Elvis's calls usually came after 7 to let me know that I'd be picked up around 8. I had to dress quickly, trying to find some way to appear older than my age. His father was concerned about Elvis being with me. My clothes were all young and unsophisticated skirts and sweaters. At times, I'd borrow my mother's clothes and hope everyone would assume that I was older. As I got to know Elvis, I learned that when he wasn't at the base, he virtually lived as a recluse. He had little choice. The moment he stepped out of the door, there was a giant mob scene around him. Even going to see a local movie required elaborate planning. Someone would drive Elvis's car in front of the house. He would then run out, hurdle the fence, and duck into the car before any of his fans could start begging him for autographs. There were always crowds after him, calling, standing outside the house, literally charging at him when he entered any public place. Many evenings when Elvis had early morning calls, it was either Lamar Fike, a friend whom Elvis had brought over from the States, or Vernon Presley, who chauffeured me to and from 14 Gouda Strasse. One particular evening, when neither Lamar nor Vernon was able to drive me home, Elvis had a friend, whom we'll call Kurt, not his real name, take me. Kurt was driving me from Elvis's home back to Wiesbaden. I was tired and dozing off. All of a sudden, I felt the road get bumpy. I opened my eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked. "You'll find out," he said, turning his head away. We had driven off the highway onto a dirt road. I could see the lights of one distant house, and the rest was all blackness. I began to get frightened. "What's going on?" I inquired, confused. By then, Kurt had stopped the car and shut off the ignition. I repeated my question, but Kurt didn't answer. Instead, he turned and grabbed me, trying to kiss me. I pushed him away, struggling. He threw me down on the seat. Panicked, I begged, "Don't! Leave me alone!" I started fighting. I kicked one door open and opened the driver's door with my hand while simultaneously banging the horn, hitting the lights, and scratching at his face. Out of frustration and fear of being caught, he finally gave up. The rest of the way home, he never said a word. I just sat there, sobbing, disbelieving, praying that I would get home safely. 3 days passed from that night before I heard from Elvis. My parents knew something was wrong, however. I couldn't tell them that Kurt tried to kiss me because I would never be allowed to ride with him again. If I didn't, how would I get to and from Elvis's if Lamar and Vernon weren't available? My imagination ran wild. I was afraid to tell Elvis because I thought Kurt was his friend. I began to think that perhaps Elvis knew what Kurt had attempted. Maybe I was just a plaything to Elvis, someone to pass around to Kurt or anyone else who wanted me. I was tortured by my thoughts. Finally, Kurt called and said Elvis wanted to see me. I had no choice but to go with him. During the drive to Bad Neuheim, Kurt made no mention of what had transpired between us, and neither did I. I said nothing. I was very apprehensive being with him. I didn't know, when he removed his hand from the steering wheel, just what was on his mind. I had no choice but to tell Elvis. That evening, when we were alone in his room, Elvis asked me if anything was wrong. My voice was trembling. I could hardly get the words out. When I finally did tell him, Elvis went berserk. "I'm gonna kill him," he shouted. He paced the floor, cursing Kurt. I was his girl, Elvis said, and he had never gone all the way with me. Now this other guy, this so-called friend of his, had tried to make a move on me. I listened as he shouted, secretly relieved at his response. How could I have ever doubted Elvis? Elvis was so incensed. It took me the whole evening to calm him down. I finally convinced him that we had to keep this secret from my parents, or I'd never be allowed to come back. Elvis held me tightly, as if trying to take the painful memory away. He felt guilty for having put me in such a dangerous position. From that time on, Kurt was virtually excluded from Elvis's life. I don't think Elvis ever told him why, but Kurt must have known. He rarely came around after that. I began to realize that Elvis expected total loyalty from his friends. If he was betrayed, he would just cut that person out of his life. Vernon was now sporting a neatly trimmed mustache that, according to Elvis, D. Stanley had encouraged him to grow. Our conversations in the car were somewhat perfunctory, and I always sensed he'd just as soon be doing something else, like spending the time with Dee, who sometimes accompanied him. These days, when I arrived at 14 Gudestrasse, I'd often find Elvis upstairs studying the ancient art of karate with his instructor, or downstairs in the living room, proudly demonstrating new moves to his entourage, who stood about marveling at his mastery of this newly popularized art form. Elvis also spent hours with a half-mad German masseur who had him convinced he could rejuvenate facial skin with his secret treatments. Elvis having always been self-conscious about some large pores on his face, Joe Esposito ribbed Elvis, saying, "What the he doing that's so special? You look the same to me." Defensively, Elvis shot back, "Well, he says it'll take some time before you see the results." Vernon interjected, "Time? Yeah, probably enough time to bankrupt us all by what he's charging. I wouldn't trust him farther than I could throw him." Always a center of activity at the house was Elvis's grandmother, whom he nicknamed Dodger. Elvis had come up with the name when he was a small boy of 5, and during a temper tantrum had thrown a baseball, missing her head by inches. Elvis jokingly said she dodged out of the way so fast. He started calling her Dodger from that moment. Grandma took care of the household, did the cooking, kept everyone and everything under control. She had the air of a person with a firm purpose in life, which, in Elvis's case, was to make sure he was very well cared for. When I sought quiet while Elvis practiced karate, Dodger's room was a place to escape to. We'd sit for hours, and she would tell me about the old days, about Gladys and her boundless love for Elvis, about the grim struggle the Presleys had waged for survival. She had been with Vernon and Gladys from the time of Elvis's birth, helping out when Gladys took jobs to contribute to the family's support. A strong woman, Grandma had prevailed when her husband had walked out on her, leaving her with 5 children. She wanted you to believe she held a grudge against J.D. Presley, but Dodger's was a forgiving heart, and I believe she still cared for him. She helped raise Elvis as if he were her own son, somewhat spoiling him as grandmothers do. She always rushed to his defense when she felt Gladys was too stern. Dodger said to me, "Gladys always called me Miss Presley from the time I first met her until she breathed her last breath." One day, Elvis came running in and said, "Hi, Minnie." I felt so sorry for that youngin'. Gladys rose up, took her hand to that boy and said, "Don't you ever call her by her first name. That's disrespectful. She's your grandma." He cried for an hour. I went in and said, "Son, it'll be all right. She was just doing what she thought was right. Now you go in and apologize to her." Poor little boy looked at me with those blue eyes, so pitiful. Oh, she could be hard on him. He was a good boy, though. Never really got into any trouble. Always came right home from school and did his chores. Yes, and Gladys would watch over him like a hawk, so scared he'd be hurt. He wanted so bad to play football at school. Grandma rocked back and forth in her chair, seeing something in the past that made her start picking at the bobby pins in her hair. She reached for a little box of snuff, took a dip, situated it just right, and then continued to reminisce. Yes, he loved sports. Then why didn't he go out for any, Grandma? Oh no, Gladys wouldn't have that. She'd tell me, "Oh, Miss Presley, I couldn't stand it if Elvis got hurt. It would destroy me." I've watched how they play out there in those fields. They get real rough. I think they enjoy hurting each other. Elvis isn't like that. He'd get out there and he'd be like a wounded bird in a pack of wild dogs. Not my youngin'. Gladys's constant effort to protect Elvis, I learned, was the result of her anguish over the loss of Elvis's twin brother, Jesse Guerin. I came to love Dodger and what she represented, compassion and total devotion to her family. My biggest problem in those days was that Elvis and I never seemed to have enough time alone. People were always dropping by, standing around the living room, talking and laughing, until Elvis came down from his room. As soon as he appeared, the room would become silent until he revealed his mood. No one, including myself, dared joke around unless he laughed, and then we all laughed. Because I had to share the little time I had with Elvis with so many others, I began to feel jealous and possessive. It was only late in the evening, when we were in his bedroom, that I was truly happy. We had a nightly ritual. At about 10 or 11, Elvis would glance at me and look toward the stairs. Then, naively assuming that nobody knew where I was heading, I'd casually proceed to his bedroom, where I'd lie on his bed, impatiently waiting for him to appear. When he joined me, he'd lie as close to me as he could. "I love you," I whispered. "Shh," he said, as he put his fingers to my lips. "I don't really understand what it is I'm feeling. I've grown to love you, Scylla. Daddy keeps reminding me of your age, and that it can't be possible. When I go home, only time will tell." Each night that I was with him, he entrusted a little more of himself, his doubts, his secrets, and his frustrations. It was a lot to expect an impressionable girl to understand, but I tried. I felt his pain over losing his mother. I ached over his desire to become a great actor, like his idols Marlon Brando, James Dean, Carl Malden, and Rod Steiger. I was concerned about his fears that he might not regain the popularity he felt he had lost by serving in the army, and I reveled in his laughter when he asked, "What if one day I end up back driving a Crown Electric truck? Wouldn't that be something?" I was there for him, to listen, to hold his hand, or to make a funny face that would turn his frown into a smile. Sometimes Elvis would enter his bedroom in high spirits. I longed for those nights when he'd shut off the lights and lie close beside me. "Sweetness," he would say, putting his arms around me. "You're so pretty, honey." And then we'd kiss, long, deep, passionate kisses, and his caresses would leave me weak with desire. Nights when his mood was calm and peaceful, he would describe his ideal woman and tell me how perfectly I fit this image. He liked soft-spoken brunettes with blue eyes. He wanted to mold me to his opinions and preferences. Despite his reputation for being a rebel, he held the traditional view of relationships. A woman had her place, and it was the man who took the initiative. Fidelity was very important to him, especially on the woman's part. He constantly reminded me that his girl had to be completely constant. He admitted that he was concerned about Anita. She was a Memphis beauty queen and television personality. Elvis said that lately, her letters had become very impersonal, and he suspected she had been with another man. Despite his moralizing, I feared Elvis wasn't always faithful to me. His bantering with some of the other girls at his house made me think that he might be intimately familiar with them. One evening, he was playing the piano for the regular group, plus a couple of English girls. When he picked up his guitar, he looked around, but couldn't seem to find his pick. "Anybody seen my guitar pick?" he asked. One of the English girls looked up and smiled. "It's upstairs on the night table next to your bed. I'll get it." All eyes, including mine, zeroed in on her as she made her way up the stairs, aware that she was now the center of attention. Furious at his obvious betrayal, I turned to him, but he was avoiding my gaze by looking down at his guitar, plucking it as if it needed tuning. Then he burst into, "Lordy, Miss Claudie." Without a pick, his fingers must have hurt badly, but no matter what, he wasn't about to put that guitar down. He knew he was in trouble. After he finished a medley of songs, Elvis excused himself and retreated into the kitchen, with me right behind him. "Have you been with her?" I demanded. "No," Elvis insisted. "Then how did she know where your guitar pick and room were?" "She was over one night, and I mentioned how dirty the place was," he answered, a boyish grin on his face. "She offered to clean it. Simple as that." Despite his declaration of innocence, I was not reassured. He was the idol of millions and could choose whomever he wanted, whenever he wanted. I quickly learned, for my own survival, not to ask too many questions. Well, that's the end of Chapter 3. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 3 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.